When Abigail inherited an abandoned mansion from a grandmother she'd never met, she almost walked away. The old house looked empty, forgotten, and beyond saving. But behind a dusty bookshelf, she discovered a hidden room that had been sealed for nearly 20 years. Inside, there wasn't a fortune waiting for her. There were faded letters, family photographs, and one heartbreaking truth that revealed she'd spent her entire life believing a lie. This isn't just an inspirational story about an inheritance. It's a powerful life lesson about family, forgiveness, and the kind of love that refuses to disappear even after decades of silence. Stay until the final letter is read, because that's the moment every secret finally comes together and everything changes. There are some kinds of loneliness that don't begin with being alone. They begin the moment you believe no one is looking for you. For 19 years, Abigail Brooks carried that quiet heartbreak wherever she went. No one had ever told her she wasn't loved. They simply told her there was no family left to find. After hearing those words often enough, she stopped asking. The morning she aged out of the foster care system. The rain drifted gently across the small town of Ashwood Hollow. One by one, the other young adults left with someone waiting outside. Abigail walked away alone. Everything she owned fit inside a faded backpack, a few clothes, a worn notebook, and an old photograph of her mother, the only family she had ever known. In her pocket were $7. As she passed a neighborhood bakery, the smell of warm bread reminded her she hadn't eaten since the day before. She stepped inside, counted her money, and quietly decided she could afford a simple roll. Before she reached the counter, she noticed an elderly man searching every pocket of his coat. "I'm sorry," he told the cashier with an embarrassed smile. "I seem to have forgotten my wallet." Without thinking, Abigail stepped forward. "I'll pay for his breakfast." The old man looked at her with surprise. "You don't have to do that." She smiled gently. "I know, but I'd like to." The meal cost almost everything she had. When she walked back into the rain, only a few coins remained in her pocket. She had nowhere to sleep, no one expecting her, no idea what tomorrow would bring. Yet, she never regretted helping a stranger, because kindness was the one thing life had never managed to take from her. She found shelter beneath the awning of a closed bookstore and pulled the old photograph from her backpack. "I wish I knew where I came from," she whispered. At that very moment, only a few miles away, an elderly woman named Margaret Brooks lay surrounded by unopened birthday cards, carefully wrapped Christmas gifts, and a lifetime of hope that had never faded. For nearly 20 years, she had searched for the granddaughter she refused to believe was gone forever. Every birthday, she wrote another card. Every Christmas, she wrapped another gift. Every spring, she planted another white rose outside Blackwood Manor, believing that someday Abigail would come home. She never stopped believing. On the final night of her life, Margaret placed one last letter into a polished wooden box beside an old brass key and a faded family photograph. Across the envelope she wrote only one word, Abigail. The following afternoon, a long black sedan pulled quietly to the curb where Abigail sat watching the rain. The same elderly man whose breakfast she had bought stepped out, though now he wore a tailored black suit. Standing beside him was a gray-haired attorney carrying the wooden box. The old man smiled warmly. "Thank you for your kindness this morning." Abigail stared in disbelief. "You?" He nodded. "My name is Thomas Whitaker. I've been searching for you." The attorney gently placed the wooden box into her hands. "It belonged to your grandmother." Abigail's heart nearly stopped. "My grandmother," Thomas gave a slow nod. Margaret Brooks never stopped looking for you. As Abigail opened the box, tears blurred her vision. For 19 years, she had believed she was forgotten. She had no way of knowing. Someone had loved her enough to spend a lifetime trying to bring her home. Abigail held the wooden box as though it might disappear if she loosened her grip. For several long moments, she couldn't bring herself to open the letter. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was something much deeper. For 19 years, she had built her life around one painful belief that no one had wanted her. If this letter proved otherwise, then everything she thought she knew about herself would suddenly become a lie. Thomas Whitaker waited patiently beside her. "There isn't any hurry," he said gently. "Your grandmother waited nearly 20 years. She would have gladly waited another day if it meant you were ready." With trembling fingers, Abigail broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, and the handwriting was unsteady, as though every word had been written by someone whose hands had grown weak, but whose heart never had. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here to tell you these words myself. I have imagined this moment thousands of times. I imagined wrapping my arms around you. I imagined hearing your voice call me Grandma. I imagined celebrating birthdays we lost and making up for every Christmas we never shared. Life, however, had other plans." A tear slipped onto the page. Abigail wiped it away before it blurred the ink. The letter continued. "Never believe that you were abandoned. Never believe you were forgotten. I searched for you every single year. I hired investigators. I spoke with judges. I begged social workers to reopen your case. I followed every rumor, every lead, every whisper that carried your name. Sometimes I was only one day too late. Sometimes the records had already been sealed. Sometimes the people who knew the truth simply refused to speak." Thomas quietly looked away, giving her the privacy of grief. She continued reading. "One day, when you know the whole story, you may feel anger. I pray you never allow that anger to become your home. The truth can set a family free. Hatred only builds another prison." By the time Abigail reached the final paragraph, she could barely see through her tears. "If there is one gift I leave you, let it be this. You have always belonged somewhere. You have always belonged with me. Welcome home, my sweet girl. Love always. Grandma Margaret." Abigail folded the letter carefully against her chest. No one had ever written words like that to her. No one had ever called her my sweet girl. She began to cry, not the quiet tears she had learned to hide as a child, but the deep, uncontrollable sobs of someone grieving a love she had only discovered after it was gone. Thomas didn't interrupt. Some grief deserved silence. When she finally caught her breath, she looked up. "Why," her voice was barely a whisper. "Why couldn't she find me?" Thomas sighed heavily. "Because someone made certain she wouldn't." The answer hung between them like thunder before a storm. He reached into his leather briefcase and removed a thick folder secured with a faded ribbon. "These are copies," he explained. "The originals are locked away." Inside were court records, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and dozens of letters Margaret had sent to government offices over the years. Almost every page carried the same heartbreaking stamp. "Request denied. Case closed. No record found." Abigail turned another page, then another. Her eyes stopped on a photograph. It showed Margaret standing outside a government building, holding a folder against her chest. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 simple words. "I know she's still alive." Abigail covered her mouth. "She never gave up?" "Never," Thomas answered softly. "In fact, she spent nearly every dollar she had searching for you. He hesitated before adding something Abigail never expected. The mansion you're about to inherit wasn't nearly as important to Margaret as finding her granddaughter. They climbed into the waiting sedan. Neither of them spoke during the drive. As they left town, winding roads carried them toward the hills overlooking Ashwood Hollow. Finally, Blackwood Manor appeared through the mist. The house was enormous, its stone walls weathered by time, its gardens overgrown but still beautiful beneath decades of neglect. It looked less like a haunted mansion, and more like a home that had spent years waiting for someone to return. Thomas parked but didn't reach for the door. "Before we go inside," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know." Abigail looked at him. "Your grandmother didn't leave this house to you because of its value." He paused. "She left it to you because she believed the truth was still inside." Abigail frowned. "What truth?" Thomas's expression grew solemn. "Margaret believed your mother's death wasn't the end of the story." Abigail felt the air leave her lungs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying keep." He looked toward the old house standing silently beyond the gates. "There were people who benefited from you disappearing. And if Margaret was right, they may still be protecting those secrets today." For the first time since opening the letter, Abigail no longer felt like a forgotten orphan. She felt like the last piece of a story someone had tried very hard to erase. As she stepped from the car and looked up at Blackwood Manor, she realized she wasn't simply walking toward an inheritance. She was walking toward the truth. And somewhere behind those aging walls, the past was still waiting. The iron gates groaned open with a sound that seemed to echo across the empty hillside. For a long moment, Abigail simply stood there. The mansion before her wasn't frightening. It was lonely. Its weathered stone walls had survived more than a century of storms, while ivy climbed slowly toward the second-story windows. The gardens had long since grown wild, yet traces of careful hands still remained: rose bushes, winding paths, and an old wooden swing hanging from an ancient oak tree. Thomas noticed where she was looking. "Your grandmother planted that tree the year your mother was born." Abigail smiled faintly. "So someone once laughed here." Thomas nodded. "A great deal." Inside, Blackwood Manor felt frozen in another time. The scent of cedar, old books, and polished wood lingered in the air. Portraits of generations past lined the hallway, each pair of painted eyes seeming to welcome her home. Or perhaps, to recognize her. Abigail stopped in front of a portrait of a young woman with chestnut hair and gentle gray eyes. Her heart skipped. "She looks," Thomas finished the sentence, "like your mother." The resemblance was unmistakable. The same smile, the same eyes, the same small dimple that appeared whenever Abigail herself smiled. "That's Eleanor Brooks," Thomas explained. "Your great-grandmother." Abigail stared silently. For the first time in her life, she was looking at people who shared her face. It was an overwhelming feeling. She had spent years wondering where her smile came from. Now she knew. Thomas led her through the grand foyer into a warm library overlooking the gardens. A fire crackled softly in the stone fireplace. On the table rested several neatly arranged boxes. "They're all yours," he said. "Your grandmother labeled everything." Abigail opened the first box. Inside were birthday cards. 19 of them. Each envelope carried the same careful handwriting. To Abigail, one for every birthday she had never celebrated with her grandmother. Her hands trembled. She really wrote one every year. Thomas smiled sadly. Even when she didn't know where to send them. Abigail opened the first card. It had been written for her first birthday. "Happy birthday, my precious girl. I hope someone kisses your forehead today." The next one wished she was learning to walk. Another wondered if she had started school. One asked whether she still believed in Santa Claus. Year after year. Margaret had written to a little girl she could only imagine. By the time Abigail reached her 18th birthday card, tears streamed freely down her face. Inside was only one sentence. "If you're reading this someday, then miracles still happen." She pressed the card against her heart. "I missed all of this," Thomas quietly answered. So did she. As evening settled outside, Abigail wandered through the house alone. Every room seemed to whisper another memory she had never lived. The music room still held an old piano. The dining room remained perfectly set, as though guests might arrive at any moment. Fresh flowers sat beneath Margaret's portrait. Someone had replaced them only days earlier. Abigail frowned. "I thought no one lived here." "No one does," Thomas replied. "Then who brings the flowers?" Thomas hesitated. "I didn't." A silence settled between them. For the first time that day, Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Later that evening, while unpacking a few belongings into what had once been Margaret's bedroom, she noticed something unusual. One of the bookshelves wasn't level. Curious, she knelt beside it. A faint scratch marked the hardwood floor beneath one corner. It looked as though the shelf had been moved many times. She pushed gently. Nothing happened. She pushed harder. The shelf shifted just enough to reveal a narrow gap behind it. Hidden in the wall was a small brass keyhole. Her heartbeat quickened. The key! She hurried downstairs and retrieved the old brass key from the wooden box. It slid into the lock perfectly. With a soft click, part of the bookshelf slowly swung inward. Behind it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Thomas stared in disbelief. "I've practiced law for this family for 42 years. I never knew this existed." Abigail picked up an old lantern hanging nearby. The steps creaked beneath their weight as they descended. The hidden room below wasn't large. It looked more like a private study than a cellar. Dust covered almost everything. A heavy oak desk stood in the center. Shelves filled with journals lined the walls. On one side rested several framed photographs. One picture caught Abigail's attention immediately. It showed Margaret, her mother, and a little girl no older than 3. Abigail frowned. "That can't be me." Thomas stepped closer. "No." He looked equally confused. "It isn't." The little girl had blonde hair. Abigail had always been brunette. Neither of them spoke. Thomas carefully lifted the frame. On the back, written in Margaret's handwriting, were 6 words. "Never let them know about Lily." Abigail's breath caught. "Lily? I've never heard that name." Thomas slowly shook his head. "Neither have I." Before either of them could say another word, Abigail noticed something else. The desk drawer wasn't fully closed. Inside rested a leather journal. Its final entry had been written only 3 days before Margaret died. Abigail opened to the last page. The handwriting was noticeably shakier now. "If anything happens to me before Abigail returns, she must never trust Richard." Thomas's face turned pale. He whispered almost to himself, "Richard?" Abigail looked up. "Who is Richard?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly lowered himself into the old chair beside the desk. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded heavier than before. "Richard Hale is your mother's older half-brother." Abigail stared at him. "I have an uncle." Thomas nodded. He inherited the management of the Brooks family businesses after Margaret became ill. But according to the will, he receives almost nothing now. Silence filled the hidden room. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place. Someone had hidden records. Someone had kept grandmother and granddaughter apart. Someone stood to lose everything if Abigail returned. Thomas looked at the final page again. There has to be more. Just then, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Both of them froze. It wasn't the sound of an old house settling. It was unmistakable. Someone had just slammed the front door. Thomas extinguished the lantern. Neither of them moved. Footsteps, slow, measured, crossed the floor directly above their heads. Abigail held her breath. The footsteps stopped. Then a man's voice drifted faintly through the silence. "I know you're here." The voice was calm, confident, almost familiar. And sooner or later, "That journal belongs to me." Abigail's fingers tightened around Margaret's diary. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, she realized something terrifying. The secrets hidden inside the house hadn't stayed buried by accident. Someone had been guarding them. And now, whoever that person was knew she had finally come home. Neither Abigail nor Thomas dared to breathe. The footsteps lingered above them for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, they faded away. A car engine started outside. Moments later, silence settled over Blackwood Manor once again. Thomas waited another minute before relighting the lantern. Its soft glow revealed how pale Abigail had become. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands still trembled around Margaret's journal. "I think so." She looked toward the hidden staircase, but someone knew exactly where to come. Thomas's face tightened. They may not have known about this room. They knew enough. He carefully closed the secret passage behind them before they returned to the library. Neither of them spoke until the front door had been checked and every room searched. The house was empty. Nothing appeared to be missing. Yet both of them knew someone had been inside. Whoever it was hadn't come to steal silver or jewelry. They had come looking for one thing: the journal. That realization changed everything. Until now, Abigail had believed she had inherited an old family home and a heartbreaking story. Now she understood she had inherited unfinished business. Thomas prepared 2 cups of tea in the kitchen. When he returned, Abigail was sitting beside the fireplace, Margaret's letter resting in her lap. The flames danced quietly between them. "My grandmother wasn't protecting money," Abigail said softly, as she was protecting the truth. Thomas nodded. "I believe so." For several minutes they simply watched the fire. Finally, Abigail asked the question that had been growing in her heart all evening. "Do you think my mother knew?" Thomas leaned back slowly. "I've asked myself that for years." He looked toward the old family portrait hanging above the mantel. "Your mother, Caroline, was one of the kindest people I've ever known." "What was she like?" A warm smile crossed the old attorney's face. "She remembered everyone's birthday. She baked pies for neighbors who were sick. And every Christmas she insisted there should always be one extra place at the table." "Why?" Thomas chuckled quietly. "She used to say, you never know who might need a family tonight." Abigail smiled through fresh tears. "I think I would have liked her." Thomas looked at her gently. "You would have loved her." For the first time in years, Abigail didn't imagine her mother as a faded photograph. She imagined her laughing in this very house, playing the piano, setting the table, walking through the gardens with Margaret. They suddenly felt real, not distant memories. Family. Thomas stood and walked toward an old cabinet. From the top drawer he removed a worn leather album. "I think your grandmother wanted you to have this." Inside were hundreds of photographs. There was Caroline learning to ride a bicycle, Caroline covered in flour while baking cookies. Margaret teaching her to plant roses. Family picnics beneath the enormous oak tree. Christmas mornings. Birthday candles. Sunday dinners. Abigail turned each page slowly. Every photograph told the same story. This had been a family filled with ordinary joys. Not wealth, not power, love. Then she reached a page that stopped her completely. A tiny pair of knitted baby booties had been taped beside a photograph of Margaret holding a newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. On the opposite page, Margaret had written only one sentence. "The happiest day of my life. My birth." Thomas nodded. "That was the day you came home from the hospital." Abigail gently touched the faded picture. "So, I was here. For a little while." She closed her eyes. Somewhere inside those walls. She had once been rocked to sleep. Someone had sung lullabies to her. Someone had whispered that she was loved. Those memories were gone forever. But knowing they had existed somehow eased a loneliness she had carried for nearly 2 decades. She suddenly realized something. My whole life, I thought I was unwanted. She looked at Thomas. "But that's not true." "No," he answered quietly. "It never was. The tragedy wasn't that nobody loved you. The tragedy was that love was stolen from you." Those words settled deep inside her. All those years. Every rejection. Every birthday spent alone. Every Christmas in another foster home. She had blamed herself. Maybe she hadn't been good enough. Maybe she hadn't been worth finding. Now, for the first time, she saw her past differently. She hadn't been abandoned. She had been separated. There was an enormous difference. Tears filled her eyes again. Not tears of grief this time. Tears of release. The weight she had carried for 19 years began to loosen. She wasn't the forgotten girl anymore. She was someone's granddaughter. Someone's daughter. Someone whose empty chair had remained waiting at the family table. Late that evening, Abigail wandered onto the back porch. The rain had stopped. Moonlight spilled across the gardens. She found herself drawn toward the old white rose bushes Margaret had planted every spring. Most were in full bloom despite the season. She knelt beside one and noticed a small wooden marker hidden beneath the leaves. It wasn't a memorial. It was a date. May 14th. Her birthday. Thomas stepped quietly onto the porch. As she planted one every year, Abigail looked up. One rose. For every birthday you spent apart. She counted silently. 19 blooming bushes stretched along the garden path. 19 years. 19 promises that Margaret had refused to break. Abigail reached out and gently touched one white blossom. Its petals were cool beneath her fingertips. She smiled through tears. I used to think flowers were just flowers. Thomas stood beside her. And now, their memories, their hope, their proof that someone believed I'd come home, even when I didn't. The old attorney smiled. That's exactly what your grandmother would have wanted you to understand. Abigail looked toward the great house standing quietly behind them. Earlier that day, Blackwood Manor had felt enormous and unfamiliar. Now it felt different. Not because she knew every room. She didn't. Not because every mystery had been solved. Far from it. It felt different because, for the first time in her life, she no longer saw herself as a visitor passing through someone else's story. She belonged here, not because of an inheritance, not because of the family name, but because love had been waiting for her long before she ever walked through those gates. She took a slow breath and looked toward the dark windows of the house. Somewhere inside those walls lay secrets powerful enough to keep a family apart for nearly 20 years. She could have walked away. No one would have blamed her. But as she remembered Margaret's final words, "Welcome home, my sweet girl," she made a quiet promise beneath the moonlit sky. "I'll finish what you started, Grandma. I'll find the truth. And when I do, no child in this family will ever grow up believing they were forgotten again." The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor for the first time in years. Dust floated gently through the golden beams, and the old house seemed to breathe again. Abigail stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee, listening to birds singing beyond the gardens. It felt strangely peaceful, almost as if the house itself had been waiting for this morning. Thomas joined her a few moments later, carrying a thick leather folder. "I didn't want to overwhelm you yesterday," he said, placing it on the table. "But there are a few things your grandmother wanted you to know." Abigail smiled softly. "I'm beginning to think Grandma planned every step." Thomas chuckled. "She usually did." Inside the folder were property records, handwritten notes, family photographs, and one envelope marked simply, "Read this after your first night at home." Abigail carefully unfolded the letter. Margaret's familiar handwriting greeted her once again. "My sweet Abigail, if you've stayed through your first night, then perhaps you've already realized this house isn't important because of its walls. It's important because of the lives it has sheltered. A family is never measured by what it owns, only by what it gives away." Abigail continued reading. "If the day ever comes when Blackwood Manor belongs to you, promise me one thing. Don't let it become another beautiful house that sits empty. Fill it with laughter again. Open its doors. Let lonely people know they still matter." When Abigail lowered the letter, neither she nor Thomas spoke for several moments. Finally, she whispered, "She never wanted me to keep this place for myself." Thomas smiled. "No. She wanted you to continue what she started." He walked to one of the windows overlooking the gardens. "Your grandmother quietly funded scholarships, paid medical bills, bought groceries for families who had fallen on hard times. Most people in town never knew where the help came from." Abigail looked surprised. "She never told anyone." Thomas shook his head. Margaret believed generosity worked best when no one expected applause. Those words stayed with Abigail long after breakfast. Later that morning, she wandered through the house once more, but this time she noticed things she had missed before. The nursery upstairs still held a small wooden rocking horse. The music room contained shelves of children's books. A sewing room overflowed with handmade quilts that had never been used. Every room seemed to tell the same story. Margaret had spent years preparing for a family reunion that never happened. Abigail gently unfolded one of the quilts. A tiny stitched label had been sewn into one corner. "For Abigail's first home." She pressed the fabric against her cheek. "I wish you could have seen me." A voice behind her answered softly. "I think she did." Thomas stood quietly in the doorway, not with her eyes, but with her faith. That afternoon, the two of them walked into Ashwood Hollow together. News of Abigail's arrival had already begun spreading through town. Some people offered warm smiles. Others watched from a distance with quiet curiosity. As they passed the bakery where everything had begun, the owner hurried outside. "Miss Brooks," Abigail turned. The elderly baker held out a paper bag. "I heard what happened." She tried to refuse politely. "I really can't." "Oh yes, you can." The woman smiled warmly. "Your grandmother never let anyone leave this bakery hungry. Now it's my turn." Inside the bag were fresh cinnamon rolls, still warm. Abigail blinked back tears. "Thank you." The baker gently squeezed her hand. "No, thank you for coming home." Those simple words touched Abigail more deeply than the gift itself. For the first time, home no longer felt like a place that belonged to someone else. As they continued down Main Street, more people stopped to speak. An elderly schoolteacher remembered Margaret donating books every autumn. A retired firefighter recalled that she had quietly paid for a neighbor's surgery years earlier. A widow confessed that someone had delivered groceries to her porch every Friday after her husband died. "I always knew it was Margaret," she said, "but she made me promise never to tell." Every conversation revealed another piece of the woman Abigail had never known. Not a wealthy socialite, not simply the owner of a grand estate, a woman who had quietly spent her life making sure no one else felt forgotten. That evening, Abigail returned to Blackwood Manor carrying far more than groceries and memories. She carried an idea. After dinner, she found Thomas in the library reviewing legal documents. "I've been thinking," he smiled. "I suspected you had." She took a deep breath. "I don't want to sell this house. I don't want to close it up. I want people to walk through these doors again." Thomas leaned back thoughtfully. "What do you have in mind?" Abigail looked around the library. She imagined children reading beside the fireplace, older neighbors sharing coffee in the sunroom, families gathering around the long dining table, people who had nowhere else to go finding warmth inside these walls. "I want Blackwood Manor to become a place where no one feels alone." Thomas's eyes softened. "I think your grandmother would be smiling right now." Abigail continued. "There are children leaving foster care every year with nowhere to go. I know exactly how that feels. There are widows eating dinner by themselves. Veterans, people who simply need someone to remember their name." She smiled through tears. "This house waited 20 years for one granddaughter. Maybe now it can welcome hundreds of people who think they've been forgotten." Thomas quietly removed another envelope from his briefcase. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." She looked puzzled. "What is it?" "Your grandmother left one final instruction." He handed her the sealed envelope. Abigail opened it carefully. Inside was only a single sentence. "If Abigail chooses compassion over comfort, give her the second key." Thomas reached into his pocket. Resting in his palm was another brass key, smaller than the first, older. "What does it open?" Abigail asked. Thomas smiled. "I've wondered that for years, but Margaret insisted it should never be used." "Unless you made this choice on your own." Abigail wrapped her fingers around the tiny key. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, she realized the greatest inheritance her grandmother had left behind wasn't the mansion, or the land, or even the family name. It was a purpose, and somewhere inside that old house, another locked door was waiting, not just to reveal another secret, but to show her why Margaret had believed that healing one broken family could become the beginning of healing many others. The little brass key rested in Abigail's palm for nearly an hour before she finally gathered the courage to use it. She turned it over again and again, wondering why her grandmother had waited until that very moment to reveal it. Not after Abigail inherited the estate. Not after she learned the truth. Only after she had chosen compassion over comfort. Thomas smiled as he watched her studying the tiny key. Margaret believed that some doors should only open for people whose hearts were ready. Together, they searched the house once more. The key fit no lock downstairs. It opened none of the bedroom doors upstairs. Just as Abigail was beginning to think they had missed something, she noticed an old grandfather clock standing quietly at the end of the upstairs hallway. It hadn't worked in years. Its hands were frozen at exactly 4:17. Something about it felt intentional. She stepped closer. Behind the face of the clock was a tiny brass keyhole. Thomas looked at her with surprise. "I've walked past this clock hundreds of times. I never noticed." Abigail slid the key into the lock. A soft click echoed through the hallway. The entire clock slowly swung outward, revealing a narrow room hidden inside the wall. Unlike the dusty chamber they had discovered before, this room felt almost untouched. Sunlight filtered through a small round window. A rocking chair sat beside a bookshelf. Children's drawings covered one wall, and on a simple wooden table rested dozens of neatly organized journals. No jewels, no stacks of money, no family treasures, only memories. Abigail picked up the first journal. Inside, every page described ordinary days. Today, Abigail smiled in her sleep. She wrapped her tiny fingers around mine. She laughed when I sang to her. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. These are about me. Thomas nodded. Your grandmother wrote almost every day during the first months of your life. Abigail opened another journal. This one had been written years after she disappeared. Instead of memories, it contained prayers. Lord, wherever she is tonight, let someone tuck her in with kindness. Another page. Today would have been her first day of school. Another. I wonder if anyone tells her she's brave. Every year, every season. Margaret had continued writing to the granddaughter she could no longer hold. Abigail lowered the journal and quietly cried, not because she felt sorry for herself, but because someone had loved her with extraordinary faith, a love that expected nothing in return. As they explored the hidden room, Thomas discovered a cedar chest beneath the window. Inside were dozens of handmade blankets, tiny sweaters, birthday candles, unopened toys, and carefully wrapped Christmas ornaments. Each carried a handwritten tag. For Abigail. Nothing had ever been given away. Margaret had kept everything. She had refused to believe her granddaughter would never come home. Abigail gently lifted a small knitted sweater. It would have fit a 4-year-old child. I never wore this. No, Thomas answered softly, but she still made it. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The room itself seemed filled with love that had simply waited. Then Abigail noticed one final envelope resting beneath the blankets. Across the front, Margaret had written, "Open this only after you understand what truly matters." Abigail unfolded the letter. My dearest Abigail, if you found this room, then you've discovered the greatest treasure I ever owned. Not this house, not our family's name, not the land. Love. Love is the only inheritance that grows larger when it's shared. Abigail smiled through her tears as she continued reading. For many years I believed finding you would heal my heart. In time, I learned something even more important. Love should never wait for perfect circumstances. If I could not love my granddaughter in person, then I would love every lonely soul who crossed my path instead. Thomas quietly closed his eyes. I remember. He smiled sadly. There were days Margaret could barely walk, but if someone knocked on her door needing help, she always answered. Abigail continued reading. If life has brought you back here, don't spend it chasing revenge. Truth matters. Justice matters. But never allow bitterness to become your inheritance. Build something kinder than the world that wounded you. By the time she reached the final page, the tears flowed freely. One day, people will ask what became of Blackwood Manor. I hope they never answer. It became a museum. I hope they say. It became a home. Abigail folded the letter carefully. She looked around the little room once more. For years, she had dreamed of finding the people responsible for stealing her childhood. She still wanted the truth. She still wanted justice. But something inside her had quietly changed. Hatred no longer occupied the place where hope had begun to grow. That evening, she invited the baker, the retired schoolteacher, the widow from Main Street, and several neighbors to dinner at Blackwood Manor. The long dining table that had sat empty for decades welcomed guests once again. There was homemade soup, fresh bread, laughter, stories. At one point, the elderly widow looked around the room with tears in her eyes. "I haven't eaten at a table with this many people since my husband passed away." Silence settled over everyone. Without saying a word, Abigail reached across the table and gently took her hand. No grand speech, no dramatic promise, just a simple human touch. Thomas watched from the other end of the table. He suddenly understood why Margaret had trusted her granddaughter with everything. Not because Abigail had inherited the Brooks name, because she had inherited the Brooks heart. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Abigail stood alone on the front porch. Warm lights glowed from the windows behind her. For the first time in decades, Blackwood Manor no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. She gazed toward the white rose garden where 19 bushes bloomed beneath the moonlight. "I understand now," she whispered. "You weren't trying to give me a mansion." A gentle breeze stirred the roses. "You were trying to give me a chance to become the kind of person you hoped I'd be." She smiled through quiet tears. The frightened young woman who had arrived with nothing but a backpack and $7 was still part of her. She always would be. But she was no longer defined by what had been taken from her. She was being shaped by what had been given to her instead. Not wealth, not privilege, but the courage to love first. And in that moment, Abigail realized the greatest miracle of all. She hadn't merely found her family. She had become the person her grandmother had believed she could be long before they ever had the chance to meet. In the weeks that followed, Blackwood Manor slowly began to change. Not overnight. Old houses never do. They come back to life one window at a time. One repaired floorboard. One room filled with laughter after years of silence. Abigail chose not to erase the house's past. She kept the worn dining table where generations of the Brooks family had shared meals. Margaret's old rocking chair remained beside the upstairs window. The faded wallpaper in the nursery stayed exactly where it had been, because some memories deserved to be preserved rather than replaced. Word spread quickly through Ashwood Hollow. People who had once walked past the empty mansion now found themselves walking toward it. The baker delivered fresh bread every Saturday morning. The retired schoolteacher organized the library. A local carpenter repaired the front porch without accepting a single dollar. Veterans restored the old barn. Neighbors planted flowers in the gardens. Everyone seemed determined to leave a small piece of themselves inside the home. Some brought tools. Some brought recipes. Some brought stories. Some simply brought hope. Within a few short months, the house that had once been surrounded by rumors had become the warmest place in town. Abigail gave it a new name, Margaret's home. Not a shelter, not an institution, simply a home. Its doors remained open to young adults leaving foster care with nowhere to begin, to widows who dreaded eating another meal alone, to veterans struggling to find peace, to families who needed help but were too proud to ask. Above the front entrance, Abigail hung a hand-carved wooden sign. It read, "No one leaves here," believing they were forgotten. On opening day, she stood quietly inside the foyer before anyone arrived. Fresh flowers rested beneath the family portraits. The scent of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen. Sunlight spilled across polished hardwood floors that had not seen so many footsteps in decades. Every bedroom held one of Margaret's handmade quilts. Every chair waited for someone who needed a place to sit. Abigail should have felt confident. Instead, she felt nervous. "What if I can't do this?" she asked softly. Thomas, standing beside her, smiled with the quiet wisdom she had come to trust. No one is ever completely ready to change another person's life. He looked toward the front door. "You simply open it." A few moments later, The first car pulled into the driveway, then another. Before long, neighbors, local families, former foster parents, church members, and town officials filled the front lawn. Some had known Margaret. Others had only heard stories about the young woman who had inherited Blackwood Manor. Each carried their own reason for coming. Near the end of the gathering, Thomas stepped onto the porch. The conversations faded into silence. "There is one final matter," he announced. He held Margaret's journal in his hands. For many years, questions remained unanswered about Abigail's disappearance. The crowd listened quietly. The truth has finally come to light. Thomas explained that Margaret's journals, hidden records, and years of correspondence had been turned over to investigators. The evidence revealed that Richard Hale had deliberately concealed legal documents, redirected official notices, and manipulated custody records after Caroline's death. His motive had been painfully simple. As long as Abigail remained lost, he maintained control of the Brooks estate. For nearly 20 years, greed had succeeded where love had failed. But not forever. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Richard finally confessed. Justice would now follow its own course. No one celebrated the news. There was only silence, the kind that follows a truth everyone wishes had never existed. A young reporter finally raised her hand. "Miss Brooks, do you hate him?" The question lingered in the air. Abigail looked back through the open front doors. Inside, a teenage girl who had recently left foster care was helping an elderly widow arrange flowers on the dining table. Nearby, two veterans laughed over a game of checkers. In the library, a little boy had fallen asleep with a book resting on his chest. Life was beginning again inside those walls. She turned back toward the crowd. "What Richard did was wrong," she said quietly, "and justice matters." She paused before continuing. "But my grandmother taught me something more important. If I spend the rest of my life hating the man who stole my childhood, then he'll still be stealing from me." Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I've already lost too many years. I'm not willing to lose the rest." She looked around at the faces gathered before her. "So I choose something different. I choose to make sure no child ever grows up believing they were unwanted. I choose to make sure this house becomes stronger than the pain it once held." The first applause came from the elderly baker. Then the schoolteacher joined. Soon, the entire crowd stood applauding, not because justice had finally arrived, but because hope had. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Abigail walked through the quiet halls. She noticed a young woman sitting alone in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Her name was Emily. She had turned 18 only 2 weeks earlier and had just aged out of foster care. Everything she owned fit inside a small canvas bag resting beside the bed. Abigail recognized the look in her eyes immediately. She had once worn that same expression herself. She knocked softly. Emily looked up. "I don't know how long I'm allowed to stay." Abigail smiled gently. "As long as you need." Emily lowered her eyes. "People always say that." Abigail sat beside her. "I know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily whispered, "What do I have to do to earn it?" Abigail's heart broke. She remembered asking herself that same question for years. "You don't have to earn a place where you're already welcome." Emily looked at her in disbelief. Then, "Why are you helping me?" Abigail glanced toward the hallway where one of Margaret's handmade quilts rested across the bed. She thought about the rainy morning outside the bakery, the $7, the wooden box, the birthday cards, the 19 white roses blooming in the garden. Then she smiled. Because someone loved me long before I knew her. And now, it's my turn to pass that love on. Emily quietly wiped away her tears. Later that night, Abigail stepped onto the front porch. Warm light glowed from nearly every window of Blackwood Manor. She could hear laughter drifting from the dining room. Someone was playing the old piano again. The house no longer felt empty. It sounded alive. She walked slowly to the rose garden. 19 white rose bushes still lined the stone path. Earlier that day, she had planted one more, the 20th rose, not to remember another year that had been lost, but to celebrate the first year that had truly been found. She knelt beside it and gently touched its petals. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered. A soft evening breeze moved through the garden, carrying the sweet fragrance of the roses into the night. Abigail smiled. Once, she had believed that home was the place where someone finally came looking for you. Now, she understood something even more beautiful. Sometimes, home is the place you create for people who are still waiting to be found. And from that day forward, whenever someone arrived at Blackwood Manor carrying an old suitcase, a broken heart, or the quiet belief that they no longer mattered, Abigail welcomed them with the same words she had waited 19 years to hear. "You are not forgotten. You belong here. Welcome home." 6 months after the opening of Margaret's home, Blackwood Manor no longer felt like a mansion rescued from the past. It felt alive. Every morning began with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen. Every afternoon, laughter echoed across the gardens where silence had ruled for nearly 20 years. The long dining table that had once gathered dust was now filled with people who had once believed they had nowhere left to belong. Some stayed for a night. Some stayed for months. Many eventually found homes, careers, and families of their own. Yet almost all of them returned, not because they needed another place to sleep, but because they wanted to help the next person who arrived carrying the same fear they once had. Abigail often stood quietly in the hallway, watching strangers become family. Each time she did, she thought of Margaret. "You were right, Grandma," she would whisper. "Love really does grow when it's shared." One crisp autumn afternoon, Thomas arrived, carrying a weathered leather folder tied with a faded blue ribbon. "I've been waiting to give you this," he said. "The investigation is finally over." Abigail looked up. "So, it's finished." Thomas nodded. Richard accepted full responsibility. There was no triumph in his voice, only relief. He admitted to altering legal records, intercepting Margaret's letters, hiding custody documents, and convincing Lily that the family wanted nothing to do with her. Thomas paused before adding quietly, he also admitted something else. Abigail waited. For 20 years. Hakas, as he believed the money would finally make him happy. Thomas looked toward the rose garden outside the window. It never did. Richard had lost the estate. He had lost his business. Most painfully of all, he had lost every meaningful relationship in his life. Those who had once admired his success slowly disappeared. In the end, he lived alone in a modest apartment several counties away. No family visited. No friends called. One afternoon, months before his sentencing, Richard asked to see Thomas. "I thought winning meant owning everything," he confessed. "I didn't realize. I was trading every person who ever loved me." Thomas never defended him. Some choices leave scars that cannot be erased. Justice had taken its course, but consequences had already begun long before any courtroom became involved. Several weeks later, Abigail traveled with Thomas to a quiet coastal town overlooking the Atlantic. There, in a small white cottage surrounded by lavender bushes, lived Lily, the woman whose name had haunted every unanswered question. When the front door opened, time seemed to stand still. Lily's eyes immediately filled with tears. She didn't see a stranger. She saw Caroline's smile, the same gentle eyes, The same quiet kindness. "My goodness," she whispered. "Oh, you look just like your mother." Abigail tried to speak. Instead, she simply embraced her. Neither woman cared how long they stood there. 20 years of lies quietly dissolved into one honest hug. Later that evening, they sat together on Lily's porch overlooking the ocean. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the waves. Lily carried out an old cedar box. "I've been saving these." Inside were dozens of letters, photographs, baby clothes, hospital bracelets, even a tiny pair of knitted socks. "Your mother made these herself." Abigail gently held the little socks in her hands. Lily smiled through tears. "Caroline couldn't stop talking about you. She used to tell me, no matter what happens, Abigail will always know she's loved." Lily lowered her eyes. "I failed her." Abigail immediately reached across the table. "No, you were lied to." Lily shook her head. "I believed Richard. I thought Margaret blamed me. I thought you were gone forever." For a long moment, only the sound of the ocean filled the silence. Then Abigail smiled gently. "My grandmother spent 20 years planting roses because she believed I'd come home." She squeezed Lily's hand. "I think she believed you'd come home too." Both women cried, not because of what had been stolen, but because, at last, nothing remained hidden. A month later, Lily moved into a small cottage on the Blackwood Manor property. She didn't come to claim ownership. She came to belong. She became the unofficial grandmother every child adored. She taught little girls how to sew quilts. She showed teenage boys how to grow vegetables. Every Friday evening, she baked Caroline's famous apple pie using the handwritten recipe her sister had left behind. The smell filled the entire house. For many of the young people living there, it became the scent they would forever associate with family. Years passed. Margaret's home became known far beyond Ashwood Hollow. Former residents returned with college degrees, military uniforms, wedding invitations, baby pictures. One by one, they came back to say the same thing. "I wouldn't be here if this place hadn't opened its doors." Abigail always answered the same way. "This house didn't save you. People did." One snowy December morning, Abigail walked into the same little bakery where everything had begun years earlier. The owner had retired, but the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls remained exactly the same. As she waited in line, she noticed a young woman standing near the register. She looked frightened. She couldn't have been more than 19. The cashier smiled kindly. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. You're $7 short." The young woman quietly checked her pockets again. "Nothing." She apologized and turned to leave. Abigail froze. Her heart skipped. $7. The number echoed through her memory. A cold, rainy morning. A paper bag. An elderly stranger. The last money she had in the world. Without hesitation, Abigail stepped forward. "I'll take care of it." The young woman looked embarrassed. "I'll pay you back." Abigail smiled. "No. You'll need your $7. The young woman stared at her. "Really?" Abigail nodded. "Trust me. You'll be surprised how important $7 can become." The cashier handed over the warm breakfast. The young woman whispered, "Thank you." Before walking away, Abigail reached into her purse and handed her a small card. On the front was written, "Margaret's home. If you ever need somewhere to begin again, come see us." The young woman looked at the address. Tears formed in her eyes. "I don't have anyone." Abigail smiled with the quiet certainty that only life could teach. "You do now." As she stepped outside, snowflakes drifted gently across Main Street. For a brief moment, Abigail stopped exactly where she had stood 19 years earlier. She could almost see the frightened young woman she once was. A backpack. A broken heart. $7. No future she could imagine. If only that young girl had known. That one small act of kindness would lead her to a grandmother who never stopped loving her. To an aunt she thought she'd never meet. To a home waiting to be filled with laughter. To a purpose greater than anything money could buy. She smiled toward the sky. Thank you, Grandma. I finally understand. That evening, every light inside Blackwood Manor glowed warmly against the winter snow. Children decorated the Christmas tree. Veterans argued cheerfully over a card game. An elderly widow taught a teenage girl how to knit. Lily removed Caroline's apple pie from the oven while everyone applauded. The house was noisy, beautifully noisy, exactly as Margaret had once dreamed. Abigail walked into the rose garden. 21 white rose bushes now stretched along the stone pathway. 19 planted by Margaret. 1 by Abigail. 1 by Lily. She gently touched the newest bloom. The flowers no longer represented years of separation. They represented generations reunited. She looked back toward the glowing windows of the house. At that moment, she finally understood the answer people had been asking for years. What was the greatest inheritance your grandmother left behind? It wasn't Blackwood Manor. It wasn't land. It wasn't money. It wasn't even the Brooks family name. It was the courage to believe that one act of kindness can begin a story that changes countless lives. Because homes are not built with stone, families are not built by blood alone. Legacies are not measured by wealth. They are measured by the number of people who feel less alone because we were here. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all. Sometimes the family you've spent your whole life searching for is waiting on the other side of one small act of kindness. Above the entrance of Margaret's home, the old wooden sign still welcomed every soul who arrived. No one leaves here believing they were forgotten. And everyone who crossed that threshold eventually heard the words Abigail herself had waited 19 years to receive. You are not forgotten. You belong here. Welcome home.